Jesus was a master storyteller. In fact, nearly 1/3 of the words of Jesus recorded in the Bible were stories called parables. Using familiar illustrations but revealing deeper revelations, parables shine a light on God's character, change our perspective, and give us practical direction in His kingdom. Once upon a time, a king came to earth to tell stories, and the stories contain the mystery of eternal life. Well, how are we doing this morning? Good. Hey, we are super glad that you guys are here. And if this is your first time here, I just want to welcome you, let you know that we're glad you made it out to hang out with us a little bit. And we'd love to get to know you a little bit better. So the best place for that to happen is out at our Next Steps tables. Those are right out in the lobby, and there's some people there who are super nice, and they would love to talk with you and even answer any questions you might have about this place and how you can get better connected. So please, before you leave, if you get a chance, stop by there, and we'd love to meet you. Also, I want to give a shout out to our friends over at our Lagodi campus. So can we put our hands together and just show them a little bit of love this morning? Yeah. Absolutely, man. We love you guys, and we're so glad that you're able to be here and to join with us today. But man, I can't believe we're already at the end of June, right? Like summer is just moving along. I know Indiana, we basically have two seasons, right? There is freezing cold, and then there is like humid and hot, and we are in the second portion of that, the humid and hot era. But I'm good with that. I'd prefer that to the alternative, but it seems like everybody's got things going on and trips and all that. So we're glad you're here and made it a priority to be with us this morning. I know last weekend was Father's Day, so I'm hoping that all of our dads were celebrated and you got to go and golf or grill out or fish or just tell dad jokes or whatever it is that you like to do. Hope you got to do that. I didn't get the chance to go home and hang out with my dad this last weekend, but I did get to spend a little time talking with him on the phone. I love catching up with my dad, and our conversations are usually really similar. Like we have the same rhythm to them. Is that, we'll catch up on anything that's going on that's new, what's happening right now. We'll talk about family, what brothers and sisters and everybody's kind of up to. And then we usually end up like he'll just tell the same stories like over and over. And I don't know if that's just an old man thing. Like they've got a few and they just tell them like on repeat, over and over. But I love it. I love listening to those stories. And we'll usually we talk about just old family stuff, like whether it's vacations we went on, trips to Florida, or, playing Little League baseball, or just anything, growing up. He likes the stories, like anything that involves me doing something dumb or embarrassing. Like those are his favorites, which is great because I love reliving all of that, so it's always really fun. But this last time we were talking and we got to kind of discussing our old trips we'd take to the lake. My family, we used to go to the lake a lot when I was growing up, and it was fun. I loved it. I still love going to the lake, but we'd go out a few times a summer and we'd take the boat, and we had this little cove that we'd go back to where we'd kind of jump in and we could swim and play and, do all that stuff, and it was great. And there was this one little cliff there. It was about 15 or 20 feet high. And my brother and sister were older, and they'd always be allowed to climb up, and they'd kind of jump off into the water, and it was super fun. But I was never allowed to until I was older because I was the youngest one in my family, so I had to wait. And so my dad said, when you turn 10 years old, then you'll be allowed to jump off the cliff with your brother and sister. And so I was excited. Like I couldn't wait until, it was finally my time. I could be one of the big kids. I'd be allowed. And so the summer after I turned 10, we go to the lake, and I can't wait. Like I'm ready to do this. So we get back there to this little cove, and we jump in and we swim over to where the cliff is. My brother and sister climb up first, and, they jump in, and they've done this before. No big deal. Everything's fine. And then it was my turn. And so, I get up there, and I get up to the cliff edge, and here's the thing. For my entire life up to this point, my perspective had always been from the water looking up at the cliff. And it always seemed like it's not that high. It's not a big deal. My brother does this. If he can do it, I can do it, that sort of thing. But now, I get up there, and from the perspective of the cliff, looking down at the water, it's a really long way. In fact, I begin to think that it is so far down to the water that it's probably high enough to kill a 10-year-old. And so, I'm starting to freak out a little bit, So I'm standing up there and I'm trying to figure out what to do. And my dad's down in the water, and he's doing the dad thing. He's trying to reassure me, hey, it's going to be okay. Just jump in. But I'm looking at him, and I start to think, what kind of a parent takes a 10-year-old cliff diving, right? This guy can't be trusted. That's just irresponsible parenting. And, just jump, he says. Well, easy for you to say. You've got two other kids. I'm just a spare. What's one less mouth to feed, right? You don't care if I die. It's one less kid to put through college. And so he says, just jump. Well, it's not that simple. Like, it's not just jumping. Like, I could jump. I was 10. I jumped everywhere we went, and all I really had to do was take one step forward and fall. Like, that's all the skills necessary for jumping off a cliff. Like, it's not that complicated, but that wasn't the issue. The real issue was, could I trust? Could I trust my dad that if I jumped, it would be okay? Could I trust him that this was going to be all right? That was the real issue. And so I was up there for a while, and eventually I did. I built up the courage, and I jumped in, and I lived to tell the tale. Like, it was all good, and we had a lot of fun doing that. And so I don't know if my dad gets any Father of the Year awards for taking a 10-year-old cliff diving, but I did learn a really valuable lesson. See, what I learned is that our primary issue is not obedience, it's trust. And see, that same thing is true when it comes to our relationship with Jesus and what it means for us to follow him, is that our primary issue is trust. Do we really trust Jesus? Because the things that he's called us to and the commands that he's given and this life that Jesus has asked us to live, the truth is it's really pretty simple. Like, it's not all that hard to understand. This isn't rocket science. It's pretty simple stuff. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy to do. That's not what I'm saying. But it is easy to understand. So when it comes to being generous, Jesus told us to be generous people. It's not hard for me to understand what that means. I know what it means to be generous. I know what that means that I should do. The hard part is, can I trust it? Can I trust that if I am generous with my time and if I am generous with my resources and with my money, if I really am generous, will I be okay? Is that the best thing for my life? Is that the best thing for me? Can I trust that? And when it comes to loving your enemies, that's not hard to understand. I know exactly what that means and what it means that I should do. The hard part is, can I trust that? Can I trust that if I really do love my enemies, if I really do love people who are hard to love, if I really do that, will I still be okay? That even if I'm taken advantage of, even if they let me down, even if I'm still wronged in some way, will I be all right? Can I trust that that is the best thing for me? So when it comes to Jesus, and we can go through all these different commands and all the things that he's called us to, the same thing is true. Can we really trust it? It's not about obedience. That's not the hard part. The hard part is trust. Can Jesus really be trusted? Well, this morning, that's what I hope that we'll be able to look at as we dive into Matthew chapter 7. So if you got a Bible, you can go on and flip over there. Matthew chapter 7. This is where Jesus has just finished preaching the most famous sermon ever. It's the Sermon on the Mount. He's surrounded by this huge crowd of people, and so Jesus climbs up on this mountainside, and he begins to preach this sermon. And he goes on to talk about some of the most personal and deeply difficult things that we have to deal with in life. He talked about things in a way that no one had ever talked about them before. No one talked the way that Jesus did. And so he said some really hard things. He said some things like when it comes to murder. We all know that murder is wrong, right? It's bad to kill people. It'd be cool if you guys would nod your heads. That's a big one. I want to make sure we're on the same page there. We do not want to kill people. But Jesus took it a step further. He said it's not just wrong to commit murder. He said it's just as bad if you even hate someone in your heart. Because if you do that, then you've already committed murder in your heart. And so he took it a step further. So he said things that no one had ever said before. And he said the same thing when it comes to adultery. We all know that adultery is wrong. But Jesus said it's just as bad if you even look at someone with lust in your eyes and you've already committed adultery in your heart. And so all of us are well, we're busted on that one. We're all guilty of that. And you may think, well, Jesus, how is that the same thing? How is that committing adultery in my heart? Well, it's because Jesus knew. He knew that your eyes are a window to your heart and that whatever you allow in your heart will eventually manifest itself in your life. And so Jesus' primary concern was your heart. And he continues to go through and talk about all sorts of these difficult issues. He talked about anger, and he talked about relationships. He talked about divorce and money and anxiety, and he pretty much talks about everything in our life that we really don't want to talk about. And we don't have time to go through the entire Sermon on the Mount this morning, but I would encourage you, take some time and read through it. From Matthew chapter 5 all the way through 7, he lays all of this out. And basically what Jesus is teaching us in the Sermon on the Mount is this is the life that he has called us to live. Life lived out to the fullest, life to the max, life to the way that he designed it is what he teaches us in the Sermon on the Mount. So ultimately, the Sermon on the Mount is the life that Jesus died for you and me to live. So he spends those 2 chapters going through all of that, laying out this life, and then he ends it. He gets to the end of his message, the end of his sermon, and he wraps up by telling us this story. It's in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 through 27. He says this, and it's pretty familiar, you've heard this. It says, anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise, like a person who builds his house on a solid rock. Though the rain comes in torrents and the floodwaters rise and the winds beat against that house, it won't collapse because it is built on bedrock. But anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey it is foolish, like a person who builds his house on sand. When the rain and the floods come and the winds beat against that house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. And so at the end of his sermon, right, Jesus has laid out this whole life. Here's the way that I've designed it for you to live. And then he tells us this story. He says basically you've got two people who are building two different houses, but they're really alike. They're really similar. They're all made out of the same materials. They've got the same design, the same number of rooms. They've all got the same doors, the same windows, the same roof. Like all of this stuff is the same. The only difference is the foundation. Is that one trusted sand as their foundation, the other trusted rock as their foundation. And based on that, based on what they trusted to build their house on, it determined everything else. So it doesn't matter what materials you use, and it doesn't matter where you build your house, and it doesn't matter any of that other stuff. The only thing that matters is what is your foundation. That determines everything else. If you trust the wrong thing to build on, then everything else will collapse. And so this would have made a lot of sense to the people that Jesus was talking to. At this time and where they lived, there was a ton of construction going on. In fact, for most of their lives, there had been this project building the temple in Jerusalem was a really big deal. And this would have affected most of them. Like they all would have seen it going on. It would have had an impact on their life. And a lot of them probably even worked on some part of this project. And also going on, there was another big project. They were building Herod's palace was going on at this time. They were trying to put that together. It was another huge project. And so construction would have been fresh on everyone's mind. And not to mention the place where they lived was near this large body of water called the Sea of Galilee. And so this would have been the center of their economic structure. This is where trades took place, where ships came in and out of. A lot of them were fishermen. Like everything kind of centered around that bay, that area on the water. And so they would have understood beaches, and they would have understood sand, and they would have been really familiar with that. And so they would have known how deceptive sand could be. That during the hot months, like this time of year, the sun gets really hot and it dries out areas of the sand, and it will get really, really hard to the point that it almost seems like concrete. And so somebody who didn't know any better might come to that, and they would feel how solid that ground was, and they might think that this is good enough to build on. Like, I can trust this. Well, the wise person would know better. The wise person would know that you can't build on sand. You have to dig beneath that to get to bedrock, because eventually sand will loosen up. Eventually it'll get softer. Eventually it'll shift and it'll move, and it won't hold up whatever it is that you build on it. So you can't trust those things. So Jesus lays all of this out, and we all know this, right? Like we get this illustration because we've been to beaches, and you have built sandcastles probably, and you probably wrote like your name in the sand and maybe drew a heart around it, so it'd look good on Instagram. Like we understand all that. But here's the thing. We all know that sandcastle and that little note, like it's not there anymore, right? Like it's gone. Because at some point it rained, and at some point the water comes up and it just kind of washes it away. Sand moves around. It's the same reason it's harder to run on sand. If you've ever gone for a run on the beach, it's more difficult because it shifts around and it moves and it slides underneath of you. It's not a solid foundation. We know this. And so there's a couple of things we can take away from what Jesus has kind of laid out. And the first one is this. We all build on something. We all build on something. So all of our hopes, all of our dreams, all of our futures are all built on something. There's something that motivates you, right? There's something in your life that gives you a sense of security, something that gives you a sense of identity. We all build on something. The question is, can that something be trusted? When it comes to your relationships, and it comes to your hopes, and it comes to your future, and it comes to what you want in life, is what you're building on strong enough? Is it solid enough that it can be trusted? Can you trust your foundation? Because we all build on something. Here's the second thing, is that we know that the storm is coming. See, the storm doesn't discriminate. It doesn't pick some and skip over others. If we look back at our story that we just read, the one that Jesus told us, it says the storm came for the wise person, right? And the storm came for the foolish person. It came for both houses. And so I think a lot of times as Christians, we get this idea that if we go to church and we're team Jesus, that we can avoid the storms in life. That, if we're a really good person, that's like our deal with God, is that if we're good, then we get to miss out on the troubles and the hardships and all that stuff that comes with it. That's kind of our thing. But Jesus has never told us that. In fact, Jesus told us just the opposite. If you look in John chapter 16, he says, in this life you will have trouble. So don't be surprised. Don't act like this isn't going to happen. He's guaranteed that in this life you will have trouble. In 1 Peter chapter 4, he says, don't think that it's strange when you face the fiery trials of life, as if something weird were happening to you. So this isn't weird. This shouldn't come as a surprise. It's not strange. Jesus has guaranteed that you are going to have some hard times in life. There's going to be hardships for all of us, for the wise, for the foolish, for all of us. The storm is coming. So it doesn't matter where you build your house, and it doesn't matter what materials you use, and it doesn't even matter what your foundation is. The storm is still going to come. The question is, will your foundation stand up through the storm? That when life falls apart, you don't. That's the question we have to ask. And so for all of us this morning, we have to kind of evaluate. When you look at your life, when you think about what you're trusting, what you're relying on, are you building on sand or are you building on rock? Are you building on God or are you trusting something else? That's the question we have to ask. Because I think for a lot of us, if we're being honest, there's some areas of our life where we might be building on sand. We're trusting some stuff that's not going to hold up. And the hard part about that is a lot of times we think that these are really good things. Like our foundation might be a good thing, it's just not a solid thing. And so maybe for you, it's your family or your career or your marriage, and those are all really good things. There's nothing wrong with those, but you can't build your life on them because eventually those things can get rocky. Eventually those things can give way, and eventually if we trust them, our life could fall apart. And so I want to look at a few things that I think a lot of people trust, that I'm tempted to trust, that we're all probably tempted to trust, that seem really solid. They seem like a firm foundation, but the truth is these things are actually sand. And the first one that a lot of us trust is our achievements. That we think that if we can achieve a whole lot, if we can accomplish some cool things, if we can get some people to think that we're a big deal and be respected and admired and all of that, then that will be enough. And so we work really hard, right, to get the right job. And we work really hard to get the promotion. And we work really hard to get the title and the right letters after our name. But the truth is that all of our accomplishments and all of our achievements is just sand. And it shifts and it can't be trusted. See, our accomplishments shift with the sand of comparison. That as soon as we compare ourselves to other people, as soon as we look around and see what other people have done, all of a sudden our accomplishments aren't that great anymore. All of a sudden they're not firm enough to build on. So think of it like this. Somewhere out there, some kid has to be the dumbest kid at Harvard, right? Like he's probably really smart. He was probably the valedictorian of his high school. He's for sure smarter than me and for sure smarter than you, all right? But he is still the dumbest kid at Harvard. Like it's inevitable, somebody has to be that guy. And somewhere out there, like some guy has to be the slowest dude at the Olympics. He's probably really fast. He might be one of the fastest people in the world. But every 4 years, we get to find out who the slowest guy at the Olympics is. Like it has to be someone. And some girl out there has to be the ugliest girl at the beauty pageant. She may be really pretty, but she's still the ugliest girl at the beauty pageant. And some rich guy may have a lot of money and he may have a really nice boat, but he's still got the smallest yacht on the water, right? Like somebody has to be that guy. And so as soon as we put our investment, as soon as we build our house, as soon as we make our accomplishments our foundation, it shifts. It's just sand and it moves as soon as we start comparing. See, it can't be trusted. Here's another thing that a lot of us like to trust. We trust in happiness, that we all want to be happy, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Nobody wants to be sad and nobody wants to suffer. We all want to be happy. Like even Cubs fans, all right? Even Cubs fans want to be happy. They don't want to suffer, right? They don't want to be miserable. And they were happy when they won that World Series because we all want to be happy. And so we work really hard to get happiness. And we work really hard to make the people we love and our family and all those around us, we want them to be happy. But the truth is happiness is just sand. And it can't be trusted, and it shifts and it moves, and it shifts as soon as we get circumstances. See, when our circumstances change, our happiness changes. That as soon as the doctor comes in and he gives you the diagnosis that you really didn't want to hear, that you're not as healthy as you hoped you were. And all of a sudden, happiness disappears. Happiness changes when your boss walks in and he says the company's changing and your position's no longer necessary. See, all of a sudden, happiness kind of disappears. And when your marriage is not going great and your spouse walks in and says, hey, I don't feel the way that I used to. And all of a sudden, where is happiness then? See, happiness can't be trusted because it just shifts with our circumstances. It comes and it goes, but you can't count on it. You can't build on it. our happiness just shifts with circumstances. Here's the third thing that I think a lot of us invest in, that we trust, is our own goodness, right? That if we can be a good person, if we can be a moral person, then that'll be enough. And that seems like a good thing. Like, we all want to be good and we all want to be moral. And that's the things that we teach our kids, right? We want them to grow up to be good and moral people. But the truth is, our goodness, our personal morality still isn't trustworthy. It's still just sand that shifts as soon as we get a little bit of perspective. As soon as we realize that our goodness really isn't all that good, that we may be all right in some areas, but the truth is there's some other areas where we're pretty bad. And here's the thing, that even if you were able to improve, like the areas where you're not good, it still wouldn't be good enough, because good was never the standard. See, God didn't set the standard at good, he set the standard at perfect. And when it comes to that, and we get that perspective, we realize that our good is never going to be good enough. We've all fallen short of perfection. It's just sand. We can't build our life on it. And so in our life, if we trust the sands of achievement, or we trust the sands of happiness, we trust the sands of our own personal goodness, we're just setting ourselves up for a collapse. All of those things are just building on sand. They can't be trusted. But luckily, Jesus says there's a better way. Jesus says, if you trust in me, if you make me your foundation, if you put all of your trust on me, I will endure. I will hold up under the fiercest storms, under whatever life throws at you, if you just trust in me. Make me your foundation. So if we look back and we read again in Matthew chapter 7, the story that he told us, he says, if anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise, like a person who builds a house on solid rock. For though the rain comes in torrents and the floodwaters rise and the winds beat against that house, it won't collapse because it is built on bedrock. What Jesus is telling us is that he is the bedrock, that if you trust in me, if you put all of your faith in me, then I'll hold up. These storms that come, they may be fierce and they may last a long time, they may be really strong, but they're not stronger than he is. But the thing is, you have to fully trust him. He wants all of your trust, and that's really hard for us. Because if we fully trust Jesus, that means we're giving up full control. See, if we fully surrender our hearts to Jesus, we're surrendering control, and we really don't want to do that. And so what we like to do is we come to Jesus and we ask for advice. Right? Like, Jesus, you can give me some advice and you can give me some tips and some life hacks. And really what we're looking for is we want Jesus to be our life coach, right? He can give us some advice and help us out when we need it, but he can't really give commands. And so we come to Jesus and we're looking for the 3 steps to make you a better you. And we want the 5 words to fix your marriage and the 7 steps to financial freedom. And that's all well and good, but that's where it ends. And when we do that and we only turn to Jesus for advice, what we're saying is we want the foundation made of rock, but we want the flexibility of sand. And so, Jesus, you can be my life coach, but you can't be Lord of my life. But the problem is, Jesus says that's not what I'm offering. See, that's not what Jesus is really after. He wants more than that. He wants you to fully trust him. He wants to do more in your life than just make you a better person. He's after more. See, if we look again at the last 2 verses of this chapter, it's in Matthew chapter 7, verse 28 and 29. It says this. It says, when Jesus had finished saying all of these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he taught with real authority, quite unlike the teachers of religious law. You see, Jesus taught with real authority. He wasn't there to give advice. He wasn't saying, I think this could be good. He wasn't saying, I think this is right, or I think this is true. He was saying, I know. I know that this is right, and I know that this is good, and I know that this is true. See, Jesus spoke with real authority. He didn't come to be your life coach. He came to be Lord of your life. He says, what I want you to do is fully surrender your heart. I want you to fully trust me 100%. That means trusting me with your career. That means trusting me with all of your relationships, with your family, with your marriage, with your kids. I want you to fully trust me. I want you to fully trust me with all of your heart. See, that's what Jesus is after. And that means that you trust him, you surrender your heart, and that means that even when you don't understand, and even when you don't know how it's going to work out, and you don't know what the future holds, and you don't know the reason why, that you still trust Jesus. That's the kind of trust that he's looking for. That's what it means to surrender your heart. And there's actually a story in the Old Testament that really kind of illustrates this for us. It's in 2 Samuel, I believe. It's when God comes to King Saul, and he asks him to do this really kind of weird thing. Didn't make a whole lot of sense, but Israel's getting ready to go to war with the Amalekites. And so God comes to Saul, and he says to him, he says, Saul, when you wipe out the Amalekites, I also want you to do this thing. I want you to wipe out all of their livestock. See, typically when they went to war and they would conquer another kingdom or another group of people, when they got done, they would keep all of their resources. That became theirs. That was like the spoils of war. But God's telling him that instead of doing that, and instead of keeping any of it, I want you to destroy it all. Get rid of all of their resources. Well, this didn't make any sense to Saul. For one thing, it seemed really cruel. Like, why would you do that? It doesn't make sense. And the other, it was like just a waste of good resources. Like, we could do other things with that. This could be useful to our people. Like, why would we get rid of all those things? So Saul says, this doesn't really make sense to me, and I don't understand why God would want me to do it, so I'm not going to do it. So once they went to war and they conquered the Amalekites, Saul ended up keeping all of those resources for himself. And then the prophet Samuel comes to him. And he asks him, he kind of confronts him on it. He says, Saul, didn't God tell you that after the war you're supposed to destroy all of these resources? And Saul goes, well, yeah, but I didn't think God really meant that. You know, it didn't make sense to me. I didn't understand why. And I actually thought it would be a better use of the resources if we use those as like a sacrifice to God. And then the people could benefit from it, and I could benefit from it. And it would just be better all around if we did it my way. That made a lot more sense. And Samuel says to him, he says this line. He says, Saul, to obey is better than sacrifice. And basically what he's saying is that, Saul, when God asked you to do this, he wasn't being cruel and he wasn't being wasteful and God wasn't confused about the circumstances. He wasn't missing anything. The point is that God didn't want the livestock. He didn't want those resources. What God wanted was your heart. And when you didn't trust him, you kept your heart from him. See, what he actually was saying is that, Saul, when you chose not to trust God, you were building on sand. See, anytime we put our trust in something that isn't God, we rely on something that isn't God, we're building on sand. See, God wants your heart. And the reason he does that, and the reason he wants your whole heart, and the reason he wants your whole life is because he wants to do something in your life that nothing else can. See, the reason he asked for all of it is because Jesus isn't looking to make you a better person, and he's not trying to make us well-behaved, and he's not worried about making you nicer or doing any of these small improvements. Jesus is after way more than that. See, Jesus didn't come to make bad people good or to make good people a little bit better. Jesus came to make dead people alive. See, that's what he's after. It's not about little improvements. It's about total renovations. The reason he wants your whole life is because he wants to give you a whole new life. And the reason he wants your whole heart is because Jesus wants to give you a whole new heart. See, we were dead in our sins. We were lost. We were hopeless. We had nothing. And Jesus came to give us brand new life. He came to make dead people alive. See, that's a foundation that we can build on. That's the truth of the gospel. That's what we're here for. And that's what Jesus came to give us. That's the rock that we can trust. If you look in Romans chapter 5, 6 through 8, this lays out exactly what the gospel is. It says, when we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and he died for us sinners. Now, most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who was especially good. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. See, that's our foundation. That's why Jesus is the rock that we can build on. See, we don't have to build on the sands of our accomplishments because it's not about what you've done. It's about what Jesus has done for you. And we don't have to build on the sands of happiness because Jesus has given us joy, and that's way better. Because see, when he robbed the grave, that means that nothing can rob you of your joy. And we don't have to build on the sands of our own goodness. We don't have to trust that because we don't have to be good people. We get to be saved people, and that's way better. See, we are being redeemed from the inside out, not from the outside in. That's what Jesus has come to do for us, to be that rock, to be that foundation that we can build our entire lives on. And so this morning, we come back to the question that we started with. Can you trust him? As you look at your life and you think about what you're building on and what your foundation is today the day that maybe you need to make a change? The day that maybe you need to trust what you've been relying on, to change what you've been leaning on, and to make Jesus your foundation. Because here's what I don't know. I don't know if you're in a storm right now, but I know that you're either in one or you're waiting on the next one to show up. The storm is coming. It's unavoidable. And I don't know when it's going to come, and I don't know how strong it's going to be, and I don't know how long it's going to last, but here's what I do know. I know how strong our foundation can be because he rose from the dead. See, when Jesus came and he lived and he went to the cross for us and he resurrected from the dead, he did that to show us that he can be trusted. Will you trust him? This morning, will you put your faith in Jesus to be the rock of your life, the foundation that you can build on? Everything else is just sand. Let's pray. And Father God, Lord, we thank you so much for being our rock that we can trust. That because of the cross and because of the resurrection, we know that you can be trusted. We know that you can overcome even the fiercest storms in this life. So Jesus, this morning I pray for myself and I pray for all of us in here that we would do that we would be willing to trust you, that even when it doesn't make sense and even when we don't know, that we're still all in, that you are still Lord of our life. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.